we're still missing opening opposition or closing opposition.
The connection seems a little choppy.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just me.
No, it's not just you.
We're still missing consent from a team. I'm unsure if it's opening opposition or closing opposition. Hello, how about now? Can I confirm if this is better?
Yes, it's better. It's still slightly iffy, but I think it's much better than before.
Yeah, it's okay. I think I can hear everyone clearly. Just don't open your camera so that I don't get disconnected. Thank you. Yeah, without further ado, can we start with the Prime Minister? Hello, is it possible to turn off the camera just in case?
I think you're cutting up again. Do you mean you want me to start? Is that what you were saying?
Omesh?
Yeah.
No, I wanted to turn off the camera.
Oh,
Yep, we can now start.
okay. Do you prefer okay, I'll keep my camera off. Just one sec. Okay. No preferred gender pronouns. Omesh, I'll be speaking PM. POI is in chat only. I'll take one from closing around like 5 minutes. So I'll wait for that. And please don't interrupt me. Okay, cool. So for the sake of time, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Our model is simple. You take these people who are defectors from these sort of like several insurgent groups, you give them amnesty and you put them in military in whatever form you provide. They have to undergo training like other military officers, and you also like sort of distribute them into different battalions. So if you have defectors who are coming in like from one insurgent group, you like distribute them in different battalions so they don't have access connections to each other. What is our main set of characterization for this debate? Note that civil unrest is like really bad. Note that a lot of people suffer when civil unrest are happening. Note that you have varieties of insurgent groups, and they like continue and like do active levels of recruitment where they like coerce like people who are coming in from like civilian sets and like through physical and social coercion like recruit them on a regular basis. And note that it's really hard to defect for these people because they're stuck in this loop of being civil unrest. We'll explain to you how like it's harder to defect later on, but that's the main characterization. But also note that like the reason they could but also note that the reason why social coercion happens in the first place is through multitude of things. Note that often at times these societies are in unrest and there's like lack of jobs and access and so on, and they like recruit people on the basis of offering them money in these regards. It looks like glorification of war when you constantly see war and civil unrest around you. You glorify war. You feel like when you see people walking around with guns, you also want to participate in it as a kid, which means like a lot of people from younger age get recruited in these sort of things. It might also mean because you have connections, you have friends who join these sort of things, which again means like you have incentive to join these sort of like recruiting groups. Or maybe you have like actual grievances where you like saw someone like being hurt by the military in the past without understanding the full context, and you make an impulsive decision to join these sort of groups, looking out for avenues and outlets to like let out your anger, right? But note that a lot of but it can also look like physical coercion, where like these people like literally come to you and like force you to like recruit your sort of groups, right? Also note that it's like really harder to defect for several reasons, right? Firstly, note that military is always on lookout for you for all the harms that you've committed. So just because you were socially cursed and you thought like killing military officers were okay, or throwing stones at them was okay because of like this glorification, and over time, as you see this process continue, you get more mature development. Because initially you were seeing these groups as externally, you were seeing them as glorified, but now when you enter, you see all of the horrible things that they do, often at times the political agendas they have, which means that you realize that they are probably not the full extent of this. But when you also have to be constantly hunted by military, you recognize this is not the life for you. So like many of them develop incentives to defect later on, but are stuck in this. The reason for this is like, as we told you, military is constantly on lookout for you, but also like these defector, like you need protections from like these defector groups, because the moment you leave them, they are also like threatening you to like sort of like prosecute you if you leave them, and also like the military is on the lookout for you. So you're stuck between like a rock and a hard place in this regard, and you're not able to leave, right? Okay, what are our main steps of like what are main mechanisms for why like this works perfectly? Firstly, on the idea of like just reintegration. So a lot of times these people are unable to reintegrate into society when they defect because of the reasons of characterization of retaliation that we tell you. So like when you put them in the military, you protect them against retaliation, because note that these like these people, like these insurgent groups, are not likely going to pick war with full military battalions to get like one defector out or like multiple defectors out. Like on the other note, it was much easier for them to hurt you when you were externally defecting. Like they can track you, they can find you, to put examples and so on. But in this case, like when they're defecting, like they're protected against retaliation because military is very hard to like encroach upon. Like at the end of the day, like all of the skirmishes they do are like more like guerrilla tactics. Like it's hard for you to like actually hunt them down and make examples in this regard, right? But also note that there's insulation from backlash. So the people that hate people from these insurgent groups like don't like feel grieved because they can rejoin society without pushback, because they're serving. So like people who see these people as harmful, people who see these people as causing civil unrest, are now like actually have a positive image of them, because when they serve in the military, it looks like a way that they're improving on the harm that they have committed in the past, and they're actually changing things for the better on our side, right? This means that this insulation from backlash means that even after at some point of time when they want to leave military, they can join society back, but they're also not like hated and scorned by the military, which means at least from a social perspective, you have incentives to like join these because you're not hated by the people. If you were defecting on the other side, these group of people will be looking at you very problematically. Okay, also note that you get many other things that you didn't have access to. When you join the military, you get access to social services, benefits. Like defectors who were coerced or pressured and later realized that maybe this is not the thing for them, they can gain access structurally to more resources as part of army with the help of rehabilitation, processing, training, but also other resources that the military has, which means you have the capacity to like now be like incentivized to join these sort of things, right? Also, before I move on, I'll take a point from closing. They have one.
How many
Opening?
people do you think
Okay,
are
all
likely
Right,
to?
sorry.
Closing,
You're still
closing.
going to take that from closing.
Closing, yeah.
How many
Okay,
people
so
do
if
you
your
think are-
characterization is that people join insurgency groups because it is that they are weak and they don't want to be killed, then why is the opportunity to join the military and be exposed to violent conflict something that encourages them to like defect and surrender themselves?
No, we tell you that initially you join them because of multitude of reasons and you're structured, and then you are unable to leave it because you're stuck in there, right? So now when you have the option, if you don't want to opt out, you probably still stay in your like sort of like insurgent group. So I don't think that's a main fundamental claim of where the debate happens. The idea is if you want to opt out, you have mechanisms to opt out and be able to engage in these sort of things. Also note that even there, as I was going in my second point and I'll explain this further, like defectors are of two types, right? Even if you have defectors who have legitimate grievances, even if this is true and they want to stay in that, right? Note that a lot of people are still incentivized to join the military because insurgency and violence isn't the best corrective mechanisms. I think over time, your initial impulse for joining these sort of like groups dies out, and you recognize that you're not making much progress. And you also realize that you're at a high risk of death because these insurgent groups are very scattered, they're underfunded, and they're belligerent. So at the end of the day, you don't have the capacity to be able to fight back in the same set. They join at least the military now because A, they are losing people who are now defecting to the military, but they also now at least get to assert some collective pressure from within the system. They're able to hold other military people around them accountable. They're able to bring about some level of internal change when they were constantly losing war, but just growing. So basically, like this war had like no sort of like solvency on that side, right? It's not whether they can actually cause change. It's about agency, the ability to assert yourself and attempt to make change structurally that they feel like they can, so they move into our side. So you get both of these sort of group of people now coming into this, because initially if you're coercion pressured, and over time you learn all of this, right? Okay, few more things, like why is this an important impact, right? Note that like having people leave defection reduces a lot of power of insurgent groups, which means that like more smaller groups easily die out because it's harder to sustain groups and so on. They have to rely on constant recruitment and keeping people locked up in fear. In this sense, if you get like significantly more people now moving out, means that like most of the time, like when these groups don't see that they are harder, like it's harder for them to grow, it's harder for them to come, and because they're underfunded and belligerent, are like feel the need to like die out. So in that sense, like it's easier to do that. But even if they combine into like one military group, you're able to deal with this more easily now because you don't have to deal with multiple insurgent groups on our side of the house. Very proud to propose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. LO, can you open your case? Also, Mauricio, can you turn off your camera just in case?
Right. Am I audible now?
Yep, you're audible, but just as requested earlier, can you turn off your camera?
Turn off. Oh, okay, sure.
All right, no worries.
I didn't.
Thank you.
That's fine. Okay, just give me 1 sec. I'll just set my timer on. Shout out to Latino America. Okay, give me 1 sec. Okay, so I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Entire villages have been burned to the ground. Innocent lives are lost. Terror has expanded, and proposition wants to award the perpetrators with monopoly of violence, and inside opposition we believe this is terrible, right? We're going to give you 3 main pushes from opening opposition. First, how this would endanger the government's legitimacy. Secondly, how this affects the militia and probably creates a state of conflict between the militia. Thirdly, why probably on principle this is incredibly unjustified, and therefore you're wronging the ones who are more innocent, right? Most of OG's case relies on the fact that these people tend to be the most important actor in the round. We don't believe this is true for 3 main reasons. Firstly, because on vulnerability, the ones who have the certainty to not have decided or consented to be part of a conflict are victims, right? We have no certainty of whether these people were actually part of the military, like of terrorist groups because they wanted to or because they didn't. Therefore, they are still part of the conflict, and they are probably more held accountable in comparison to the most vulnerable, right? Secondly, probably the most vulnerable people are the ones who cannot defend themselves, right? We're talking about people who are probably, we're talking about children, we're talking about like old people. This means that they are much more vulnerable. But thirdly, I believe that a lot of people have been targeted by these groups. A lot of people have suffered pressure from terrorist groups to give them things in change of their support. Probably a lot of people who are poor have seen the government being really, really terrible of them. But a lot of them have not chosen to pull the trigger and to be terrible. This means that probably responsibility and your own choice to actually be part of these groups is something that matters in the debate, right? So we're going to prove why the conflict endangers side proposition and why that is terrible for the innocent people, right? Firstly, a little piece of rebuttal. I believe that as we're already in the middle of the conflict, the issue about getting much people like conscripted in the first place is not probably really big because you already have a lot of conscription because you wanted to be as prepared as possible for the conflict. Secondly, notice that probably this won't give any specific advantage to the military, right? Firstly, most of the people from that OG has claimed that probably going to be like joining are probably not really like, we're not really like in the elite or probably like related to the main leaders from these groups. This means that they don't have any valuable information about these groups because they probably were just on first line. They're probably just starting to get into the group in the first place. So I don't believe they have any valuable information. But also, notice that in your side of the house, probably now the terrorist groups have a much more incentive to make it really hard for people to actually leave, right? This means, for example, targeting snitches and probably controlling their resources, and threatening them to leave, right? If you leave the organization, we'll probably kill your family, we're gonna take away your money, we're gonna probably like run you away. So this means that probably alert these groups to actually be significantly more empowered and control these people, right? So now, moving on to the main points here. Firstly, how this looks terribly. Note that people won't actually react the way OG wants to claim, right? Wounds are completely open. Notice that people have already associated with these groups with death and pain, right? Notice that when you're in the middle of conflict, your biologically levels of fear tend to increase significantly. This means you are less rational, but also you tend to associate the ones who are related to these groups with all the negative emotions, right? This is taking advantage, for example, by populist leaders in oppositions, or like, I don't know, like people who want to be new warlords or want to get more support out of war. And this is the kind of people who can actually use people's pain to say to the government that they are not being legitimate, right? That probably they are using and calling the killers and probably the perpetrators to be part of the militia in the first place, right? But secondly, amnesties probably were terribly received by people. When you have been suffered for a long time and you see people who have endangered you being like awarded with a military uniform and with all the resources that come with it and all the security, you feel in a lot of pain because you have been left out by the government, and someone who has been terrible to you is actually doing much, much better. I believe this rage also motivates people to question the government, right? What are the main impacts of this? Firstly, notice that people start to mistrust the militia even more because now I'm in a paranoid state because I don't know who to trust. I don't know if the military who's getting a patrol near to my house is actually getting, like, it was part of the group in the first place or not. So this means probably I don't want to first reveal information to them. Secondly, I probably am more hostile, like communities who have suffered a lot probably are more hostile to soldiers now because they don't trust them anymore, right? This is terrible because soldiers rely a lot of inside information from people from, I don't know, like rural areas who know where the terrorists were hidden. They need the support of the community to get them resources and to give them a place to hide. When you lose this confidence, you're probably getting into a lot of issues, right? But secondly, why there are internal fights? If you already bought, why probably like you have a massive conflict between people who mistrust like these new defectors, think about the militia. People who have been trained to actually being hostile to them. You have constantly been trained to dehumanize your violence, your enemies, to believe that they are like rejected and they deserve the hate you want to give them, right? But thirdly, you have seen how terrorists have destroyed your people, how your friends were killed in war. This means that firstly, tensions massively arise between a squad. Probably this looks like, for example, possible violence against these people because you don't trust them anymore and you want to put justice in your own hands. Secondly, you probably have more issues and tensions with your commanders because you believe that your commander is now helping or supporting somebody who was terrible to you or who probably supported a horrible cause. Thirdly, you have lack of trust in one squad. You don't want to give information, for example, for your position or your situation in the field when you're fighting to these new soldiers because you probably believe that they can tear you away. They can they can snitch you, right? But this probably also increases tension for soldiers. I'll take firstly CG and then I'll explain the impact of this.
Right. So assuming all of those problems can happen at start or that they can be predicted by generals because they're not that stupid, why can't the military enact measures to deal with all of this?
There are absolutely no measures because what you need to defend is these people getting into the military in the first place. They need to like work with the other soldiers. This is inherent to the motion. Lastly, tensions between soldiers arise massively because you cannot sleep at night because you don't know if your partner, if the other soldier is going to kill you at night because it was related. When you are constantly in the fear of war, your paranoia gets much better. Lastly, notice that on principle, this is completely immoral, right? Firstly, they have taken everything away from victims. They have created irreversible damage, and also they have taken away all possible agency for victims. And I believe that they are expecting to have their agency given back to them, right? The only way in which victims feel relief, and everybody here is a victim because they're all suffering from terrorism, is to see these people pay for their crimes. When victims who didn't consent are constantly struggling with risking their lives because they want to denounce information, they deserve something in exchange, which is justice, which is something that prop is never going to give it to them because they're privileging and giving more benefits and privileges to the ones who are terrible to them. Very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank LO for that fine speech. Not to open up the extension for opening government, let's have Deputy Prime Minister here.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're loud and clear.
All right, give me 1 second, please. Okay. So POI is in the chat if possible. Yeah, gonna start in just a second. Okay. Starting my speech now in 3, 2, 1. Two things in the speech. First, some responses to OO and some framing of the round. And then secondly, some new points on OG and some impact analysis. So first on OO, let's look at the main pushes. I think the first thing we get from them is on who the relevant actor in this debate is, right? So they say these defectors, the people who are leaving, are not the real victim. They're not the people who we actually should care about in the round, and that we should instead care about the people who these insurgents have done damage to. A few responses to this. I think that first, this falls behind all of Omesh's characterization as to how these group recruits, what these insurgent groups look like, and how they act in areas of social unrest, which is specifically that the people who are most vulnerable in these groups, the ones who are using this option to leave, are the people who want an option to leave and are locked in because of social and coercive pressure. These are people who've been forced into service, who've been forced into violence, who are at higher risks of death or danger, who don't want to be in the position that they're in, but have been forced and coerced to do so. In that, I think that these people actually are a relevant moral actor in this round. I think there's been no response to actually how the socialization happens, and no response as to why the people we're talking about aren't actually coerced and aren't actually victims. So I think that it's not enough for OO to just say, oh, we don't care about these people, we want them to suffer, because I think that there are injustices that are done to them, and that's important. But secondly, even if we do care about the victims and justice, I think that there's a probability issue here, because I think that we care far more about ending conflicts in the first place. We care far more about like declawing these insurgent groups and having like more solvency than we do about just justice. So in that case, then I think that even if we do care about the victims of these people, right, I think we still serve them better in the long run on OG side. More on that later. Let's talk about, also another idea then is the victims who have been oppressed by these insurgency groups have also probably lost family members and friends who have been press ganged into service by these people through coercive measures, which means then that I don't think there's as much a push as OO wants for these people to just say, kill all the insurgents, don't let any of them come back to our side, don't let any of them get any amnesty. I think that this is a more nuanced debate than what they claim. They also tell us that this doesn't really help the government at all, because what happens is that these people who join us now don't have any information, aren't the leaders, cannot help us. The reason that this is still good for the government, the reason that this still helps them defeat insurgent groups is primarily because of the collective action push, which is to say, if I'm an insurgent in one of these groups and the people to my left and right have left to go defect to the army, what happens? The opposing force I'm facing is now far stronger, and the force that I'm in is far weaker. There is now a collective pressure, right? A prisoner's dilemma, in which I know that the people on either side of me are going to defect, which increases the pressure for me to defect as well. So when governments implement this policy, what happens? It means the rank and file of all these associations start taking these in ever increasing groups because there's a collective pressure for them to do so. This means that even if an individual soldier coming from an insurgency to the government doesn't help them that much, the fact that this soldier moving creates mounted incentives for other people to also defect means that over time you actually get huge impacts on reducing the amount of insurgency groups and the harms that they cause. In that case, I think it's actually really good for the government that they do this, right? Let's talk now about the optics, which is the rest of their arguments. First, on the principal point, they say that what you're doing is that you're like letting these people avoid punishment by putting them in positions of power when they have actually done a lot of consequences, right? So I think a few responses. One, I think there is also still a principal duty of the government to the people who have been forced into these insurgency groups that we hold on our side, because Omesh told you about how we help these defectors who otherwise can't help themselves. But even more importantly, I want to know what the actual alternatives are. What this is this is a punishment and remuneration mechanism, right? These people are not getting off scot-free just for saying, okay, I won't point a gun at the government anymore. What's happening is they're forced to serve the government, forced to repair the damage they're caused, right? They're forced into service, right? This is a remuneration point, which means it's possible for them now to make up for all the harm that they've done. What is the counter on opposition side? The counter on opposition side is not that the government now gets to like take all these people prisoner and put them all on trial one by one. The counter is that these people are left in these insurgent groups that are belligerent, that are underfunded, that are badly like set up, which means these people then die in conflict with much more regularity, right? So what Op is saying, Op's counterfactual, is not we catch these people and put them on trial. Op's counterfactual is people who are forced into the situation, who have no agency, are forced to be killed by the government for something they don't believe in, instead of having any opportunity to make things right for themselves. In that case, I think we actually win the principal clash because one, we serve the people who need help. Two, we provide a way for them to do remuneration and like, you know, make up for the harms that they've done, right? Further on, then what do we get? We get this point on mistrust. So I'm going to deal with this, right? I think that we put, I think that in the model that we put, which is also the point that the POI that CG brings up, right, is that governments are incentivized to do this in a way that's effective, which means they do things like training, they do things like splitting up defectors into different battalions. They take steps that OO claims cannot be taken, but they do take them because generals aren't stupid and want to avoid these harms as much as possible. Secondly, note though, that individual soldiers don't have much capacity to cause harm unless they collectivize. I think we fixed that. And finally, I think that when the government does this, they do so in a way that rationalizes this to the public, wherein they say, these people are now being made to make up for their crimes to you and help us defeat the insurgents. They do this because they don't want the backlash from the people, which means that these mistrust arguments are largely declawed. Let's talk about what we get now from the side of OG. Right? I think that there's two main ideas here. First, on the impacts to defectors. Let's talk about this. The people who want to leave but can't. Omesh explains why they get locked in and why that's necessarily bad. We allow reintegration, which means that at least we save their lives and give them a future. But B, these people, this is important because these people are socially coerced and they can't get out. We give them a way out and declaw insurgents at the same time. Secondly, then, on defectors who have grievances against the government. I think that even these people who are against the government for a good reason or whatever good reason they think is good, realize once they join an insurgency that they're not getting anywhere. At least these people are just safer on our side because we've already explained to you why them fighting in an insurgency group is far worse than them fighting in the military, because insurgency groups are just at higher risk of being killed, higher risk of having problems, higher risk of being like killed by superiors, things like that, right? But what you also do now is you provide these people an active mechanism to change the system from within, wherein if they have a problem with how the government's acting, they can now act as government officers instead of acting as like insurgents trying to fix the problem through violence. I think this is both morally better for them, but also as more people join, you actually get more organic, nonviolent change. But most importantly then, why do we end conflicts more and more quickly on OG? I think as conflicts drag on, the direct impacts are felt mostly by citizens who are caught in the crossfire. What is the impacting look on this? I think these people lose access to healthcare, transportation, and education, because these are the systems that insurgents target most often in these conflicts in order to cripple the government. These people on the ground now lose access to basic services, they're caught in as collateral damage, and then there's increased riots and unrest as a result. So the lives of all people, not just people in insurgency or outside, are much worse the longer the conflict drags on. So regardless of why insurgents are revolting, the revolt has real outsized harms to people. These are the most proximate harms in the round, and these are the harms that OG solves most effectively, because we tell you why. Even if the people that we're not recruiting don't have like amazing information or aren't going to like single-handedly fix the problem, recruiting them over creates a collective pressure, which means that over time, these insurgencies dissolve. Because the people who form the rank and file who allow them to commit their atrocities want a way out and realize that by collective pressure, they have to take the way out, which means even if you don't buy all the impacts we give you to specific actors and groups, what happens on OG, the main impact we claim, is that we actually resolve the conflicts much faster. Regardless of who's in the right, who's in the wrong, or what has happened, I think the most important impact that we get in this round is specifically that we stop these cyclical harms from happening, that we reduce levels of conflict, and that's the most important. So proud to propose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to open up the extension for opening up sessions, have Yellow.
Hey, thank you. Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, I'll just say something before starting. Mau, gracias por venir acá conmigo, te quiero mucho. Emily, gracias por verme, te amo mucho. Okay, I'll start. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, look, guys, let's cut the crap. Where Mauricio and I come from, we really don't buy that Hannah Arendt banality of evil bullshit. You don't offer an amnesty, a service weapon, and a fucking badge to a criminal that used a weapon to shed the blood of their compatriots. I'm going to beat OG in 4 different grounds, from more to less charitable. Firstly, we're going to prove why these people are actually culpable and they had optionality. 3 mechanisms right here. A, there are people that didn't join the insurrection groups. There are people that didn't use a gun. There are people that didn't rise against the government in a violent way. The fact that you were pressured to do something does not mean that you are not culpable. I could be pressured psychologically by Mao to kill, let's say, Omesh. That doesn't mean that the decision that I take is 100% influenced by Mauricio. I still have rationality. I still have the ability to weigh if this is something I could do or not. I still have my own personal morality. So that means that the fact that you were pressured simply doesn't mean that you are not objectively guilty. That's bullshit. Secondly, At the very beginning, these groups don't have the coercion ability that OG claims, because let's take it at their best. Even if sometimes the fact that you are pressured means that you are not objectively culpable, that requires a very high threshold of influence and coercion against you. At the very beginning, these groups start small. They don't have the ability to menace you. They don't have the ability to kidnap your family. They don't have the ability to bribe you because they're very small. At the very beginning, they usually don't have massive funding. That happens afterwards. So all the people that join these groups initially are for sure culpable. But thirdly, insofar as that is correct, usually the characterization in these countries is that you also have democratic groups that are against the government in place, against the military, and so on. For example, in the conflict in Colombia, at the same time that you have the paramilitary groups, you have new parties, democratic ways that use democratic mechanisms. So you did have the option to raise your valid political beliefs in a non-violent way, yet you decided to use them and to canalize them into a fucking military group. That's why you're still culpable. But look, we're not winning only on those grounds. Fuck it. Let's say they're not objectively culpable. The fact is that from civil society, which is the majority in these countries, they are perceived as culpable. And that is a weighing mechanism that's going to be relevant in this round. Why do they perceive them as culpable? A, because they are. B, because they see the atrocities that they committed. C, because when you are not violent, you perceive all violent actions as a very, very risky and threatening thing. That is very important because it then means that we need to ask the big question, who should we prioritize? We say that we should prioritize that civil, non-violent majority. Why? Because they didn't choose to break the social order. They didn't choose to break that social contract in which we all operate. So they are far more relevant in this round. But also, prioritizing them means that we end conflict sooner on our side, which is the third way in which we beat the opening government. Look, they have a very dumb claim, which I'm sick and tired of debaters doing in every fucking round, which is, you're not stupid. You have an incentive to do this the right way, to do it in the most reasonable way. Yeah, you know, the fact that you want to do something in a particular way does not mean that you have the ability to do it. Mauricio gives you mechanisms that prove that it's absolutely impossible to include fucking criminals into the military without that meaning that you'll create tension, without meaning that you'll create distrust on the military. It is factually impossible because there are two options. You either say who they are or you don't. If you don't say who are the particular ex-members of a paramilitary group, then the problem is that you have an incentive as a civil person to distrust absolutely everybody. You don't know if the military that's knocking on your door was an ex-criminal or if he wasn't. Secondly, this is also important. You distrust them because of the particular position of power that you're giving them. When you give someone a gun and a badge, you're also give them the immunities that come from being a military person. That means that you're actually giving this person a lot of power, which means that people on the civil society see this as extremely threatening. And that is important because it actually means that they cooperate less, which means that you lead into conflicts lasting longer on their side. And you know what? Even if CG comes up with very clever debater, progressive explanations as to why they are not actually culpable, explain that to Miss Juanita, who had her daughter killed by a paramilitary group. Ask them if they're going to perceive that as a legitimate thing. You're basically going against all the interest of the victims here, which won't buy the Hannah Arendt argument coming from OG and potentially CG. Now, the next part is why we make those groups more violent on their side, which they also ignore, to the extent that someone that gets out of the group is potentially a snitch and potentially someone that gives valuable information to military groups and to the government. Essentially, you have an incentive to become now extremely coercive. Now you have an incentive to force people to stay in. Now you have an incentive to bribe people. That is like a much harder incentive that you had before, right? Before they only left, but you could think like they still have political alliances to us, so the fact that they retire the parliamentary group doesn't mean that they're a big risk. Now you have a particular incentive to think that these people might join the literal military because they might do. And insofar as that is correct, you create a massive vacuum in which you force these people in worse terms now. Now you create future of those bullshit victims that OG talks about. If coercion happens and you coerce people into staying in these groups and do horrible things, that happens more on OG. We beat you on your own grounds. I'll take a posting from CG because OG is unambiguously out of this debate. CG.
Why do the defectors defect in the first place?
You know, that's a very interesting question. Mau and I talked about that, and our realization was that there are many options why they could defect. It could be A, that they are sick and tired of killing people, as OG says. B, they were never so relevant in the paramilitary structure to begin with. Or C, they got treated badly or their political beliefs changed. And each in one of those scenarios got losses, basically because if it is correct that they weren't never relevant during within the organization, that means that the valuable knowledges that they can give to the military simply are not there. If it means that they changed their perspectives, this just, I think, proves that they did have a reflective space to realize that what they did was wrong. Hence, probably they had optionality, hence they're culpable. So we beat again OG in the first contention. And in the third scenario, I forgot what it was, but trust me, we still beat you there. Finally, and just to be clear on what we are saying and what we are not saying, we're not saying that we believe that these people are culpable in each and every scenario, but we are saying that each and every time you'll do this, you'll decrease the trust in government, which in a conflict is the most important thing because it's the only institution that can make things right and that can guarantee peace and avoid more people dying in the future. I am astonishingly proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. To open up the closing half of this round, let's have closing government, starting with MG.
Right, POIs in the chat, please. And I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's start with responding extraneously to the parts of OO's case that clash with our case, and then I'll bring in one piece of extension. Firstly, rebuttal. They say that militaries will be dysfunctional because there will be an issue with regards to loyalty and the trust of those defectors. Firstly, I think there are 4 reasons as to why there still should be trust. Firstly, the defectors have been treated badly by the insurgents, and they are aware that joining the military is their only option. Therefore, they do not ever want to lose that. And everyone is aware that there isn't any other better alternative for them. And in that instance, you can trust them because you know that they have nothing else to do but to follow orders and to not betray people. Because if they would go back to their insurgents, they would also be hurt. Secondly, the motion gave those defectors mercy, right, by the virtue of giving them amnesty, which means that they now see the state more favorably, even if they didn't see the state that favorably before. Thirdly, the fact that when you join the military, when you train together, when you do the drills together, when you suffer physically together, you make fun of the commander who is making you work more than both you and your comrades think that you should, creates bonds between the people who engage in this. So even if initially you came from different places, you can still then form those bonds through the rigor that the training offers. And fourthly and lastly, note just that there is a selection bias with regards to which people are likely to be defectors. That is to say, you're probably not a massive ideologue, but a very practical person who also practically chose to defect in this specific instance. When I ask why they defect, the reason they give are like, yeah, they're pretty much like practical people who did this for like a bunch of like the 3 different reasons that they offer. The second thing though is, even if there is still mistrust, I think that generals and like the state is able to operationalize this to make sure that this mistrust doesn't hinder the capacity of the military. OG here somehow managed to be derivative of us because they just reiterate my POI, so no more to be said here. Let's then start with our extension, which is simply that conflicts end sooner, even if it's just by a few months, and that's good, and that's extremely good. Firstly, let's just take a look at why or when do defections happen, because ideologues never defect. They fight until they die, right? People who have massive hate towards the state fight until they die as well. Therefore, the people who defect are likely to be people who are very pragmatic and who have joined in the first place because of pragmatic considerations. This could be maybe because they were initially coerced, maybe because they believed that there is a higher chance of them getting a better life with the military, with the paramilitary group, or for whatever reason, they believe that their situation could somehow be improved, right? What then happens is that defections occur en masse when the paramilitaries realize that they will very soon lose. This can look like they realize maybe in the next 1 to 2 years they will lose because they are aware of the morale, maybe the declining supplies, the losses and whatnot. These rumors spread amongst the fighters, even if they're not necessarily at the top echelons of the paramilitary groups. This is crucial framing because this tells you that the motion primarily occurs in situations where the paramilitary groups are already losing. This means that when you allow defectors to join militaries and through that also incentivize more defections, you are able to end those conflicts quicker, even though the state would have won them anyway. 3 reasons as to why this is so. Firstly, you get more manpower because you're literally having more people join the military, right? Secondly, you take away manpower from the insurgents because you incentivize insurgency, they have less people, and that can also hurt the morale because others see that more are leaving. And thirdly, you get useful information from those defectors. OO says, you're just a pawn. Even if that's the case, which it doesn't have to be, because for example, in Somalia, like the previous leader of Boko Haram is now the fucking like Ministry of Defense and responsible for absolutely annihilating them. No, sorry, Al-Shabaab, but they're like responsible of absolutely, he's responsible for absolutely annihilating them. So that's factually just incorrect. But even if you are just a pawn, you still know things about like the morale, your different tactics, where other troops are positioned and things like that. What is the outcome of this? As the conflict ends maybe a few months sooner, maybe a year sooner, maybe the insurgency gives up, or maybe it's easier to quash them. The comparative, and this is important, can very often be a drawn-out conflict, trench warfare, a stalemate, guerrilla tactics, or maybe a conflict that still ends but lasts a bit longer. Why is this the most important thing in this debate? And note that OG talks about this in like the last 30 seconds of their DPM. So let's do a bit more here. Because the biggest sufferers during conflicts are the civilians, not the ones who get shot, but the ones who are deprived of resources. This looks like lacking infrastructure links and the inability to get food, the inability to access key medicine or water filters to be able to get clean water. This looks like you having to flee home and having to live with insecurity and change places, which can like have detrimental impacts for people's lives forever, or the fact that you lose your job because there is no economic security and deprivation of investment. Note that this leads to people having terrible lives, but also civilians dying. Most deaths during conflicts don't occur from casualties by people being shot, but from things like starvation. So this is an extremely important impact. Before I continue,
OG tells you that you're going to put these people into a lot of massive training. We tell you that these military groups will probably like force them to stay. So your reducing conflict impact is really, really uncertain.
No, it's not, because the 2 other mechanisms are still independent of that, even if like this would be the likely outcome, right? Note that even if the regime is not necessarily a good actor, we don't care because the regime eventually wins anyways. So you're comparing a situation of conflict and instability versus some stability under a possibly good or bad regime we don't know. Why is this weighing over what we have heard so far? Firstly, it is extremely realistic in the sense in which this motion occurs more often, and I think both top half teams have missed the context of this debate and therefore have missed the most occurrences in which this takes place. But secondly, it also takes them out on their principal clash, right, beyond taking them out on scale and intensity for obvious reasons. But it takes out the principal clash of, do the insurgents deserve or not deserve this? Because victims are 100% innocent, and we're able to weigh saving more innocent victims and civilians during conflict, irrespective of if it's justified or not to give amnesty to defectors. So because of that, we beat them both on their practical and their principal considerations. Very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now to open up the case of closing opposition, let's have an O. Here.
Do I turn on my camera? Is that a no-no?
It's better if you don't.
Okay, sick. Okay, that's good. I'm not wearing makeup. I'll start on my first word. Yeah, POIs in chat, my bad. But realistically, Simon will have to take the POIs. Okay. There are two ways to end an armed conflict. Either you engage in negotiation or you win through a Pyrrhic victory by conquest and conquering. We say it is infinitely preferable to negotiate for three reasons. First, it is the only way to co-opt all of opening's benefit because we literally stop the war and we end the cycle of violence that is perpetuated. But secondly, we save numerous loss of lives, which may potentially be lost on the way to a military victory. And third, there's an opportunity cost here because money that would otherwise be spent on the war effort can instead now be spent on negotiation and spent on reconstruction after the negotiation. The reason government is going to lose this debate is because negotiation is significantly less likely on their side of the house, or at the very least, the cycles of violence and armed conflict are significantly intensified. I would like to note that opening government has not met one of their burdens. They had the burden to prove that states giving amnesty to defectors is a good thing, which I don't know if they proved, but something which they didn't talk about is why uniquely defectors need to serve on the military. Surely to achieve a lot of the benefits of signaling and providing employment or rehabilitation or whatever, you could just put them in gardening or in kitchens. There's a myriad of other ways to achieve the same things. OG did not prove why serving in the military is uniquely the only way to do this, so they have not argued the motion and they should not be considered. On CG then, I would just like to say, and this is a debater in me, they've said that you can easily leave, and that's their slippery slope argument. So if one person leaves, it has a signaling effect and other people continue to leave. I think there's two notes here. The first is that opening government already tells you that it is difficult to leave. So they would actively be contradicting their opening if that was true. But secondly, I think insurgency groups are not democracies. The leaders have strong holds over their people. They have leverage over your friends and family. They know where they live. And often these people have no incentives have no alternatives of ways to escape. So I think it is not that easy to leave, and more the people who do end up leaving are going to be traitors. These are the people who've run away, and these are the people who have nothing left to lose. One important point of framing, which I think helps us win over opening opposition, I think the possibility of winning armed conflict is incredibly low for three reasons. Because one, multiple groups exist, right? These groups are continuously at war with each other. Think of the current conflict in Ethiopia. There's Al-Shabaab, there's the Tigray People's Liberation Frontier, and there's the Somali state resistance. These are independent armed groups that are all at war with the state. I think this is something that all other teams have completely neglected. These are groups who control their own slats of land, have their own levels of power and their own hierarchies. The fact that they're physically not proximate to each other means that they can sort of hold on to their own territory, but they don't have the amount of manpower required to invade and engage in separate invasions. This is also why the state is unable to make significant progress in terms of gaining military and land. I think why this is the most important context, it is most likely to arise because there's multiple groups and there's multiple incentives that we account for, but more importantly, there's the largest scale of violence. And thirdly, it is the largest scope of conflict, and it is the most relevant to the conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, which are happening today. What this necessarily means that armed conflict is extremely unlikely to be resolved. If violence stops through armed conflict and the government wins, obviously opposition would completely lose this debate. But because opening of opposition has not proved why violence will not be resolved, they depend on this framing on why violence will not be resolved, which means, and the state, because if the state wins, obviously they get legitimacy. So since they depend on this framing, I think we should weigh over them. What is our extension then? First, we're going to tell you that we significantly prolong armed conflict and we are less likely to bring all parties to the negotiating table. There's three reasons for this. The first is on the military. Now you give a signaling effect and you give the political power to the military to say we have won, but more importantly, we have defectors who've joined us. So do you think they're going to send one or two extra people to the front lines? I think the marginal impact of that is quite low, as OG already says. What they're going to do is that they're going to be paraded around the Times Square. It is going to feed the propaganda machine. There's going to be posters and YouTube videos all over the world about how there's defectors. On our side of the house, you don't give the capital to the military to do this. And more importantly, if they sustain losses in the short term, that is good, because it means that they're weaker and they're more likely to negotiate. Second, there's what happens to the insurgency groups who lose people. If it is true that they lose some people, I think it is still a loss because each insurgency group on its own is not a massive enough power to overwhelm the state. If that were true, it would not be an ongoing state of conflict, which means that since these people have lost people and like they've just lost soldiers on the ground, and more importantly, if there is a hit to morale, the leaders on the ground, because of the engagement we've done with CG, have a strong incentive. The leaders of this insurgency group have a strong incentive to double down on their authority to ensure that things are stronger, which means on our side of the house, the things are better because they're not cornered by their enemies. Like the fact that they don't have to like, oh, and more importantly, on their side of the house, you give the state, even if the state manages to fight back, now they're actively on the defensive, which means they're significantly less likely to negotiate because, you know, they're just fighting for their lives. Why would they negotiate? I think their psychology just takes over. Third, on other insurgency groups, I think now if one insurgency groups get weaker, it gives other groups in the status quo a chance to strike because now they have an incentive. It has shifted their incentives to gain territory. So now instead of focusing on the state or whoever else they were focusing on, they have the chance to eat up the smaller insurgency group who has certainly gone weaker, even if their hierarchy of order has collapsed. And secondly, you set a precedent because now the state has set a precedent. You can capture your enemies and you can take prison, you can add them to your military. So if that is true, and if it is true that a lot of the leaders of the insurgency groups were once part of the state, they're going to start replicating what the state is doing, and they're going to start adding people from other insurgency groups to their own insurgency groups to prolong the conflict. I don't think they have the gains from the additions to their own military if that happens on our side of the house because these tactics are not employed. What is the impact of this? The first is that on our side of the house, or at least there, negotiation is significantly less likely. And I think stopping the armed conflict should be the biggest goal because of the top line revenue, because we save lives. But at the very least, we can get a ceasefire in these countries and save millions of lives and thousands of people whose communities are devastated, who opening seems so much cares about so deeply. But second, even if you don't believe that these places will negotiate, I'm sorry, Simon, you're the PO guy. Even if you don't believe that negotiations will happen, because what does happen is that conflicts get worse and violence is significantly more aggravated. Because when you make someone weaker and you corner them, and the enemies of these violent insurgency groups have the opportunity to gain territory, the opportunity to fight each other, and more importantly, the state has the ability to propagate their machine, you give them significant incentives to continue to prolong the fight, and that in and of itself makes it significantly worse. I think they're not going to negotiate, which should be the goal. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Now to close the case for government bench, let's have government bench.
Okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Alex's extension is winning this debate for 3 reasons, and I'll talk about them as I go team by team. First reason is the crucial framing on the power dynamic that likely exists between the state and the insurgency groups in this debate, right? Our opening has completely missed this, so they're not necessarily talking about the most relevant cases to this debate, and they don't analyze why defection is likely to occur in the first place as a result. Second reason is the focus on civilians, which are unambiguously innocent and also just primarily probably the most vulnerable groups within this debate, because most civilian conflicts end in people having limited access to medicine, etc. So these are the most important stakeholders likely within this debate. And third reason is just the comparative of drawn out conflicts likely causing these harms to civilians in the first case. Okay, first response to what we've just heard from CO, right? They say that negotiation is more likely when people don't defect, right? And they give a few reasons for this, right? First, insurgents are like no longer doubling down. So your insurgents now have an incentive to negotiate. First, I don't understand why this incentive to negotiate isn't also just the incentive to defect, right? Primarily, like presumably, if the insurgency groups now have the incentive to negotiate, they're doing so because of a practical reason as to why they would want to end the conflict, right? This is likely done up through the hierarchy where the leaders of the insurgency or certain members agree that negotiation is the most optimal outcome for them because they do not want to continue the conflict. I don't understand why these people wouldn't want to defect, or at least the members that are convinced that they do not want to continue the conflict would not want to seek amnesty and follow the solutions that we are providing on government side, right? I don't understand why they would not want to just take the clearer incentive that we are offering them on gov side, right? Note that this clear incentive also comes with the benefits of military training, the benefits of income, the benefit of just no longer having to face the social shame of having been involved in these insurgency groups because you can now overcome and remediate your position. All of the things that Alex had basically said, right? All of these things are better than negotiation and are therefore a higher tier incentive. And I don't understand why people wouldn't be doing this instead of negotiation. Also, on the insurgency groups doubling down thing, I think there are a few reasons, like even if you buy their mechanisms, why, or even if you buy that negotiation is the better option than just defecting, why their mechanisms won't work. First of all, I don't think insurgency groups are going to become more coercive and threaten snitches. This is also a response to opening opposition for two reasons. First, they won't want to do this because as opening opposition and most of the op bench concede, like people are joining these things for like a reason, right? They don't want to become extremely unattractive to join because they are constantly threatening all of their members. This would severely limit the amount of people that are able to join these insurgency groups in the first place. It's just a stupid thing to do. I think the second thing is if you're constantly threatening your members and you're constantly devoting resources to surveilling your members, this is just taking away critical resources from your insurgency group in order for them to be effective. So I don't understand why they would want to do this and double down and threaten all their members. All of those things are extremely terrible things for you to do as an insurgency leader, right? But look, taking op at their best, even if the insurgency groups are doubling down and they're dedicating all these resources and they're constantly and they're becoming extremely unattractive to join, I don't understand why this doesn't just weaken the insurgency groups to the point that the state has more power over them and you can now end the conflict sooner because these insurgency groups are less powerful on our side, right? All of those things are just benefits to us. Okay, the next thing they say is that conflict is prolonged because insurgency groups come together to fight against the state because they realize that this is now something that they can do, right? I don't understand why they aren't already coming together if this is an option for them. I think that there are probably not that many insurgency groups that are diverse anyway. Like, why are different insurgency groups even under this debate, right? Presumably, like, there's one state, there's probably one large insurgency group. I don't understand why there's several different ideologies that are competing within a single state. So I think this mechanism is quite unclear anyway, right? Okay. Another thing that CEOs say is that insurgencies are coercive, so people don't leave them in the first place. Okay, this is true in the status quo, but we make this far better on our side for the reasons that Alex gave you, which is that defecting is now far more worth it. You're far more willing to consider the risks of defecting now that the state is going to offer you these benefits in kind, and you're also presumably in the belief that the state is going to win, so it is far more likely for you to defect in the first place. Okay, moving on to opening opposition with CEO taken care of. All right, first, they say that insurgencies double down. I've already addressed this. The second thing they say is, generals may have the incentive to not do this in a stupid way, but maybe they don't have the capacity to, right? Okay, I guess we have to give a structural reason, even though I think this is pretty self-evident, right? Governments and generals have a large bureaucratic military agency that goes over all of their decisions. They're not going to allocate like random people to different squads. They're not going to make these insurgents like commanders of the new battalion to like fuck over their entire military structure for obvious reasons, right?
Hello.
They have the incentive.
Okay. I think the chair just left.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe we need to pause for a bit.
Okay.
Let me just find.
I think disconnection policy is like 2 minutes. If they come back in 2 minutes, I think you can begin.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah. They're back? Oh no, okay.
Hello, sorry, I got disconnected.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Where did you last hear me?
The last thing I heard from you is CEO is now taken care of, and then you're moving to the next team.
Okay. I don't know. I'm at 5 minutes and 6 seconds right now after pausing it. So would you like me to go back like about like 20 seconds or something?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Okay. Okay, resuming the speech in 3, 2, 1. OO's claims are similar in that they say insurgent groups become more coercive and double down and threaten their leaders. I've already given responses to this as to CO. And the second thing that OO say are that we may not know even if generals have the incentive to do this well, they may not have the capacity, right? I think generals have the capacity to do this well for a couple of like structural reasons. The first is that like they have a large military bureaucracy behind them that checks over all of their decisions, and so they're probably not going to make stupid decisions like allocating these insurgents to the leader of a new battalion and endangering their military structure, because they generally just have a lot of checks and balances to make sure that if they are doing these things that they can retract the decision, or they can make sure that it's not being done poorly in the first place. Okay, before I move on, is there any POI from OO?
Your impact rely on thousands of people defecting. It is first unproven, but secondly, it also increases our impacts of how probably tensions arise. People tend to be really, really paranoid when they are at war. Therefore, they don't rationalize as you claim.
Look, we agree that certain ideologues will continue to fight until they die, right? But I think for the reasons that you also provide on OP, certain people are practical. They either want to end the conflict for a certain reason. Alex gives you a ton of reasons as to why they perceive that the state is going to win anyway. I think all of these anybody who is practical in the insurgency group has the incentive to defend and to defect, and has a better capacity to do so on our side. So we get more defections on our side, so that the insurgency groups just gradually lose power. Okay, moving on to why we beat our opening, right? I think our opening does pretty good mechanization as to why insurgency groups gradually end up with more defections, but I think they miss the crucial framing as to what the state and the insurgency group's power dynamic likely looks like, right? A lot of people are going to be defecting because they perceive that the state is going to win, right? This provides the incentive in order for them to defect in the first place, and is somewhat prior to a lot of their mechanisms as to why people would want to defect in the first place. I think the second thing that OG is missing is that they don't often take OP at their best, right? OP has a lot of challenges, like civilians are going to mistrust the state, insurgency groups are going to double down. OG is completely missing the rebuttal to this, and so a lot of their case is somewhat dubious as to whether it lands in the end. For all of those, sorry, I actually have 20 seconds left. So okay, that in addition to that, right, I think that OG is missing the comparative, right, in that like there are drawn out conflicts that exist on OP side that don't necessarily exist on our side, right? The drawn out conflicts accrue to the most vulnerable in terms of civilians, in terms of the worst off people, and those are unambiguously innocent. We're winning on both ops metrics and on our own metrics on the most innocent people being protected. For all of those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Now to formally close this debate, let's have opposition whip right here.
Hello. I hope that I'm audible. Normally I would turn on my camera, but it seems that that's a bad idea, so I'm not.
Yep, you're audible.
Cool. I'll take a POI. Do it verbally because I'm not very reliable when it comes to looking at chat. I'll try and take it at around 5 or so, 5 to 6. I have a lot of content that I want to get through. Yeah, unmute, say POI if you have one to offer. This whip is going to be a little unconventional. I'm cool with taking the 2 on CO. I'll note how it is that we differentiate from opening opposition, but I just want to obliterate GovBench. GovBench has 2 paths to victory: increased defection and increased military might. This maybe means that it is a conflict ends earlier. That's what it is that TG tells you. Let's address why it is that they don't get either. On why it is that they don't get increased infection, right? Like, if it is that there are defectors to insurgency groups, it's because it is that those insurgencies are becoming increasingly weak and increasingly decentralized. It's because states have been successful in crippling the administrative and strategic capacity of insurgency groups to do things like coordinate people into violent opposition through policies like the decapitation of generals or like leaders. It is that insurgency groups are unable to do things like be victorious in insurgent campaigns and guarantee safety for their members. And it is that insurgency groups are unable to do things like discipline or coerce their members when it is that they defy or like show signs signs of ideation for defection. Right now, this is just the pitting analysis with what OG tells you on why it is that defection doesn't happen, because it is that weak people want to leave, but it is that they can't in the status quo. I'll note that it is that their own closing takes honor analysis, but let's directly refute what it is that opening government says. They say that it is that weak people are coerced socially, financially, and physically, and it's really difficult for them to leave insurgency groups for that reason. On social pressures, this probably isn't relevant because when it is that you are taking in defectors, you are probably relocating them, right? It is that most insurgency groups are not equal in size to the state. It is that they have strongholds in particular regions, but it is that they don't have a national or continental influence outside of a small area. So at the point at which you simply relocate defectors, it is that social pressure doesn't exist. On financial pressure, they say that it is that they fix this by giving them military jobs and salaries. If it is that you can fiat paying them military salaries and rehabilitation, you can also probably fiat giving them jobs related to farming and such. Lastly, on physical coercion, this probably just isn't relevant to the point at which you defect, and it is that you're no longer proximate to those insurgency groups. Therefore, right, it is that insurgents probably defect because it is that insurgency groups are losing. What this means for potential defectors is that their decision-making calculus isn't, oh, do I defect or do I stay with my insurgency group and continue to live my everyday life? It is, do I let myself be killed when it is that I stay with this insurgency group or be captured and prosecuted for higher charges, or do I just surrender myself and ask for leniency? OG concedes this when it is that they say, you give insurgents the opportunity to redeem themselves instead of just being killed by the state. Their alternative is not like their alternative, they don't need amnesty because their alternative is literally fucking dying, right? They probably surrender themselves and they defect to receive more lenient sentences because their alternative is literally that it is that they die, or it is that they get hit with harder sentences when it is that they are captured because they were uncooperative. This is how it is that you have defection on op bench. Why don't you have defection on government bench then? Why is it comparatively worse when it is that you make amnesty contingent on military service? It is precisely because of what it is that OG tells you, right? These are weak people that don't want to be proximate to violent conflict. When it is that they are only able to defect, when it is that they are forced to serve in the military and be more prone to death and violence, that is probably something that is going to discourage them from defecting from insurgency groups. So it is that we flip OG's own metric on them. But I also think that it is they probably want to defect on either side of the house. Like if it is that they want to defect on either side of the house then, right? It is that the comparative is then whether or not they face justice for their crimes or whether or not they get off scot-free. This is what it is that OO says. It is that CG says that civilians are important and it is that they're innocent and that most civil conflicts end in civilians being crippled and killed, and we want to stop this by ending conflicts early. You don't end conflict early because it is you don't get increased defections. I think that it's probably actually worse for civilians when there are people that have been terrorized by insurgents and then those insurgents are suddenly able to join the militaries of states. Refer to OO's analysis on this. Civilians are not a winning point for closing government. Okay, let's, yeah. I think that it is adding on to this though, right? I think that it is that prosecution is important, and it is that you shouldn't just offer amnesty because it is that you want to prevent more insurgency groups which may form when it is that people become disillusioned with the states and their legitimacy. If it is that you are been terrorized by an insurgency group that did something like, I don't know, fucking kill your father, and then it is that the state decides, oh, I'm going to give you amnesty and I'm going to fucking employ the guy who killed your dad to join my military and fight for me. I think that this is something that makes you more hostile towards the state, as it is that OO says, right? OO says that it is that state legitimacy is weakened, and it is that people become more hostile to states and soldiers. But it is that they don't explicitly address how it is that this increased hostility probably means that it is that other insurgency groups form, or other neighboring insurgency groups are strengthened because it is that disillusioned people defer to anti-state parties at the point at which they become disillusioned with states. On OG's own metric, it is that we are winning them over. Let's talk about their second path to victory, though, right? Which is military might. I have 4 responses to this, and 4 reasons why it is that military might is probably going to be worse on government side. Sure, I'll take the POI.
Note that even if you have negotiation is happening, negotiation is harder because people are unable to defect because they have no mechanism. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. On our side, at least you have an avenue, and perceptually when people are defecting, you have better chances for negotiation because
you're stuck between a rock and a hard place on either side of the house, right? Either you fucking die or it is that you defect and you get hit with prosecution and probably light charges, things that are comparatively better than just fucking dying on opposition side, or it is that you get hit with amnesty, and this is bad because it is that then civilians get antagonized, and it is that they probably join insurgency groups and they probably strengthen insurgency groups. Let's talk about the 4 reasons why it is that military might is probably worse on government side then, right? The first is sabotage. This is something that I think OG tries to preempt when they say that they're going to split up defectors across battalions, but it is that sabotage still remains possible, and is that people that pose as defectors can probably do things like transmit battalion location data to their insurgency groups that make it such that they're easier to kill and easier to find. The second response to this, right, is that defectors probably don't provide any advantage when it comes to military might, because by OG's own analysis, it is that they are weak people who are averse to conflict and dying. It is that they don't add any military might because it is that they aren't trained to be soldiers, right? The third response to this is that having more people, especially when it is that they are weak and bad, is probably actually bad for your military. Why is this the case? Because it is that you have soldiers that are more oblivious and less careful. It is that they're able to do things like give away the position of their entire battalion, which means that everyone it is that they are with are killed because it is that they were spotted and everyone they were with was subsequently spotted after that. But the last response to this, right, is if it is that you believe what it is that CG says about how it is that militaries are competent enough to sufficiently train their recruits, it is that they have military bureaucracies and they have generals that are able to ensure that it is that like people that defect from insurgency groups are sufficiently able to become like good soldiers, then I really just don't see why it is that there is a need for increased military might to begin with, because it is that it seems as if your military is already competent enough, right? Refer to what it is that CG tells you and what it is that CO also tells you about how it is that insurgency groups are already losing. If it isn't, you're also going to say that it is that state militaries are already really fucking strong. I don't see why it is that you need increased state might. We've denied both gov benches paths to victory insofar as it is that they don't get increased affection and insofar as it is that they don't get increased military might proud to oppose.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful speech. Debaters, please cross the house and go back to the main hall. Observers,